go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming to the latest installment of the Globalization Speaker Series here at Mershon, which I run along with Sarah Brooks. My name is Alex Thompson. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department and a faculty affiliate here at the Mershon Center. I'm very pleased to welcome Ed Mansfield. Ed is the Rosen Professor of Political Science and Director of the Christopher H. Browne Center for International Politics at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on and has made important contributions in the areas of international security and international political economy, with, I would say, cross-cutting themes in the areas of international institutions and the relationship between domestic politics and international relations. He's the author of 3 books, Power, Trade, and War with Princeton, Electing to Fight, Why Emerging Democracies Go to War with MIT, and Votes, Vetoes, and the Political Economy of Trade Agreements with Princeton again. He has also edited roughly 10 books and published more articles than I can, I could shake a stick at them, but I'm not going to try to list them all. But many articles in the top journals in political science and international relations. Ed received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and before moving back to Penn for his current position, he was at Ohio State University, where, of course, his crowning achievement was chairing the search committee that hired me. Today he'll present. A lot of payback. Took a long time. Today he will present a paper that's in progress. He's definitely looking for feedback on the project, titled "The Political Economy of Financial Reform: De Jure Liberalization versus De Facto Implementation." And after his presentation, we'll have some discussant comments from Rafael Cunha, PhD student in the Political Science Department. And with that, I'll turn it over. Welcome back to Ohio State, Ed.
Thank you very much, Alex. So before I get started, I hope you'll allow me to thank both Sarah and Alex for the invitation, and to just recount how really pleased I am to be back here. I spent 5 really terrific years on the faculty of Ohio State, and I'm particularly happy to be at Mershon, which generously funded a variety of my projects, which were much better for both the support I received, but also the feedback of various colleagues and friends, many of whom are in the room. So thank you very much. So this project is joint with Vit Hennish, who's a colleague of mine at Penn. He's in the Wharton School. And it's often the case that people begin talks of this sort by saying that it's work in progress and they want comments, when really what they want is just for you to tell them how great the paper is. I'd be happy for you to tell me that, but I really do want your feedback. This is still at a fairly early stage. This is an area that, frankly, is fairly new to me. I haven't done much in finance before, so I'm learning as I go, and I can use all the help I can get. Over the past 25, 30 years, there's been growing interest in the political economy of reform. And a lot of this kind of crystallized in the late 80s and early 90s when John Williamson famously argued in favor of what had become known as the Washington Consensus. The idea that market liberalization of various types was crucial for countries in the developing world to further develop and promote economic growth. And this has led to, as many of you know, many, many studies on the political economy of financial reform. One of the notable features of this literature is that all of it, that I'm aware of, focuses on policy reform. It is targeted at trying to explain why countries elect to make policy changes in a neoliberal direction and when they decide to make those changes. Virtually none of it, however, addresses the issue of whether that policy change actually gets implemented and what its effects are on the economy. And that's what's motivating this project, because we all know that there's a lot of slippage that occurs between policies that are enacted and whether they actually are implemented and their effects. So in the lingo that I'm going to use today, we need a better understanding of the conditions under which de jure reforms, that is the policy reforms, are enacted, but we also need a better understanding of the conditions under which those policy changes are implemented, yielding what I'll refer to as de facto financial liberalization. So there are four key features that I'm going to emphasize in terms of explaining policy reform. There's nothing particularly novel about these four factors. They're emphasized in a wide variety of studies. These are interest groups, domestic political institutions, macroeconomic fluctuations and crises, and international financial institutions. So, in turn, interest groups. There are obviously a wide variety of segments of society that have an interest in financial policy, but the financial sector stands out in this regard. And as a general matter, we argue that it tends to oppose financial liberalization. For one thing, financial repression generates rents for the financial sector, which liberalization erodes. It also exposes the financial sector to foreign competition, which it typically dislikes. Banks don't like foreign banks coming in and competing. Financial firms don't like foreign financial firms coming in and competing and the like. They also don't like prudential oversight and government regulation, as we all know. And so as a consequence, financial interests will typically oppose policy reform. It will also oppose, after policy reforms have been made, the implementation of those reforms. And it will do this in one of a number of ways. One is regulatory capture. So there are often close ties between the regulators that are supposed to enforce the policy reforms and the financial interests that are supposed to be regulated. And this can undermine the system, as we know in various aspects of politics. Secondly, especially in democratic systems, it is often the case that financial interests have ties into the legislative branch of government, contribute to the coffers of legislators and the like, and so by generating legislative opposition to policies that are sometimes put in place by the executive branch, the financial sector can sometimes can undermine implementation as well. Turning to political institutions, the focus here is going to be on regime type. And there are a set of arguments that have been advanced about why democracies might or might not be more likely to engage in financial reform. One argument is that financial reforms tend to exacerbate income inequalities, and the typical voter dislikes income inequality. Financial liberalization makes it difficult to redress income inequality through taxation, because one of the things that the reform typically does is makes it easier for capital to move quickly overseas. So democracies, based on this argument, are less likely to enact financial reforms than other regime types, because they have bigger problems with voters that don't like it and a harder time redressing the consequences of it. Another argument that's been advanced is that democracy can impede or distort the implementation of reforms by making regulatory capture easier. There are also people who have argued that democracy promotes reform, because if we're not concerned about the distributional consequences of financial liberalization, reforms in general promote growth, enhance macroeconomic performance. The average voter likes that and rewards leaders who undertake such activities. And there is also the argument that autocrats in particular like repressed financial systems, so they're less likely to liberalize than Democrats are because the repressed financial systems allows them to distribute rents to their cronies, their allies, their friends, and the like. Turning to crises, there seems to be a widespread agreement that crises promote policy reform. And the argument there is that even groups that gain from repressed financial systems understand that in the face of crises, the situation gets so bad that they're better off doing something to address the crisis than doing nothing. So this is a very common argument in the literature. Crises promote policy reform. However, crises, regardless of whether that turns out to be true or not, may also impede the implementation of that policy reform. And there are a set of reasons for this. One is crises also have the capacity to hollow out governments. They make it harder for governments to actually do anything. Secondly, one feature of government reaction to crises is often to bail out the banking sector. So that even if you put policy reforms on the books, governments often undertake actions that are antithetical to those policy reforms because the banking and financial sectors are key interests that have to be accommodated in order for the government to remain in power. And finally, some people have argued that these policy changes may occur in the face of crises, but crises frequently pass relatively quickly, in which case there isn't much political will left to actually implement the policy change. Finally, international financial institutions, and here my primary focus is going to be on the International Monetary Fund. So again, there's a good deal of consensus that participation in IMF programs promotes policy change, not least because the IMF often demands it. They make neoliberal reforms a condition for the loans. But there are various people who've suggested that that's about as far as the process gets, and that countries that accept IMF loans frequently don't follow through and implement those reforms. One reason is because actors in these countries resent the outside interference of the IMF in the first place, so there's a tendency to take the money and run. You make the reforms that they insist on, and then you do nothing in response because there is a lot of resentment about outside interference, perceived violations of sovereignty, and the like. A second reason is because financial repression creates rents, and governments often don't want to deal with the political fallout of making actual implementation of policy changes that's going to be politically costly to them, since groups whose rents are eroded are not going to take it sitting down. So this in a nutshell are the four arguments that I'm going to spend the rest of the talk testing and discussing the results of these tests. So in order to do this, we need measures of policy change, and we need measures of the implementation and effects of these policy changes. The policy change stuff I'm going to take right off the shelf. There was a well-known paper in the American Economic Review in 2005 by Abiad and Modi, updated in an IMF staff paper by Abiad and his collaborators in 2010, in which they code 7 different dimensions of financial policy and changes in such policy. So credit controls and reserve requirements, interest rate controls, entry barriers into the financial system, state ownership of banks, policies on security markets, banking regulations, and restrictions or the lack thereof on the capital account. So there is this index that they create, ranges from 0 to 21, and we're going to use what they come up with as a set of codings for whether there has been policy change in a neoliberal direction. So that's the de jure side of things. Now, where we enter the picture is on the de jure, on the de facto side. So, building on work that's now over 40 years old of McKinnon and of Shaw, there are a variety of things we should observe if those de jure reforms are actually implemented. We should, for example, see rising interest rates, since interest rates tend to be artificially repressed in repressed financial systems. We should see lower interest rate spreads between the rates on loans and the rates on deposits. We should see lower rates of inflation, and we should see greater disbursement of credit, especially in private markets. So, what we do is take 7 different time series, some of which are deliberately redundant, different measures of the same thing. And we are going to, for each country, look for what are referred to as structural breaks in these time series. Now, not every time series is available for every country, although for every country that we analyze, at least 4 of these are, and sometimes as many as 7. And we're going to look for structural breaks that are in, quote unquote, a neoliberal direction, that is, in this direction, these directions. In the 3 years after we observe the de jure change. So the first thing we're going to do is look for a de jure change. And I'm going to run some analyses based solely on that, which is the same thing that everyone else that works in this field does. And then we're going to look for de jure changes. And where we see them, we're going to say, okay, over the next 3 years, and the results, by the way, are invariant if you use 2 years or 4 years. Over the next 3 years, do we observe a structural change in a neoliberal direction? And I'm going to argue that that is an indication that those reforms were implemented, and at the very least that they had the intended effect on the economy. This gives you some sense of the global pattern of financial liberalization, both de jure and de facto, over time. At the very least, you can see that they move in the same general direction. They're certainly not perfectly correlated, but they move together. So we're going to run 2 different analyses, as I described. There are a common set of independent variables here to measure the financial sector. We're going to use the size of the financial sector as a percentage of national income. We're going to use the regular old polity measure that most of you are undoubtedly familiar with to measure regime type. We're going to control for the ideology of the head of state's political parties, since various people have argued that right-wing parties are more likely to engage in financial reform than others. We've got 3 measures of IMF participation, structural adjustment programs, which were then renamed poverty reduction and growth promotion programs, and since, I think, 2010 have been renamed again. The extended fund facility and standby agreements to see if any one of those 3 promote reform. We've got a measure of economic crises, a measure of the business cycle. We're going to control for per capita GDP and for the level of financial openness on that 0 to 21 scale, since obviously the higher you get, the less room you have to engage in further reform. To make life more difficult for ourselves, we're going to include country and year fixed effects. So that's the identification strategy for those of you who are causanistas. And we're going to start with a simple bivariate logit where we're just interested in predicting the de jure change. Okay? And the results are ones that I think people working in this area would view as pretty plausible. So poorer countries are more likely to engage in policy change in a neoliberal direction than richer countries. The bigger the financial sector, the less likely you are to engage in reform, which conforms with the interest group story that I laid out. Structural adjustment programs promote policy reform. There is this ceiling effect. As that 21-point index, you get higher on that, you're less likely to engage in further reform. And right-wing governments are about 30% more likely to liberalize than centrist governments. These are all the statistically significant results. This is all in the paper for people who want tables. You can see them there. The remaining factors have no significant effect, however. So now we're going to move to the novel part of the analysis, which is to say, trying to decompose these policy changes into those that get implemented / have an effect on the economy, identified again through these structural breaks, and those that don't. And in particular, what we're going to do is estimate a multinomial Logit model in order to try to determine what the political and economic factors are that distinguish between, again, de jure reform that leads to de facto reform and de jure reform that doesn't. And a lot of these factors are decidedly different than the ones that we earlier saw predicted whether you engaged in the de jure reform by itself. Crises, for example, reduce the prospect of the implementation of policy reforms. IMF structural adjustments reduce the probability of the implementation of policy reforms. So in combination with what we found earlier, this is the take the money and run story. The participation in these structural adjustment programs make it more likely that you'll engage in the policy reform and less likely that you'll implement the policy reform. Recessions have some effect, but not robust, so I'm not going to bother spending much time on that. Financial sector size reduces the prospect of implementation. So in combination with the earlier results, a bigger financial sector, a more potent financial sector, reduces the odds that you undertake the policy reform in the first place. But if you do undertake the policy reform anyway, it also reduces the odds that you implement the policy reform. And democracy, which has no effect on whether you undertake the policy reform, has an effect on whether you implement it. Democracies are less likely to implement policy reforms in other countries. And to put it more precisely, given the way that the model is set up, as countries grow more democratic, they grow less likely to implement policy reforms. Focusing for a minute on that latter result, we try to figure out better why that's the case. And to do this, we take apart the polity index. So for those of you who are not steeped in this, the polity index is made up of 5 different components which are laid out here. The competitiveness of the process through which a country's leader is chosen, the openness of the process, the extent of the institutional constraints on the leader's decision-making authority, the competitiveness of political participation within the country, and the extent to which binding rules regulate such participation. So, we include these variables one at a time, and after a little bit of additional analysis, it turns out to be the case that it is the extent of the institutional constraints on the leader's decision-making authority that is driving the relationship, the effect of democracy. And it turns out to be the case that the extent of those constraints is driven almost wholly by the distribution of power among the branches of government within democracies. Or to put things more simply, how co-equal the power of the executive and the legislative branch is. So basically what's happening is that this result is being driven by the extent of checks and balances among branches of government, especially the executive and the legislative branch. So what it suggests is that one branch is advancing the policy reform. The other branch has a tendency to try to offset it somehow, because you've got these heterogeneity of interests, and the executive says, okay, here we go, we're going to make this policy reform. The legislature, which may represent different interests, have a different party composition, says, we're going to try to put the brakes on this however we possibly can. Maybe we don't fund what's necessary to make the reform implementable. Or conversely, it may be the legislature that says we're going to make the policy reform. The executive branch is the one that handles the regulation, and either the regulators are captured, or the executive branch says we're not going to follow through, and so consequently the implementation is scuttled. So the next couple of slides just summarize what I've been discussing in terms of putting the different pieces of all of this together. But recessions and crises in particular, don't have the effect that the literature suggests on the policy reform. We observe no effect on policy reform, but crises do hinder the implementation of those reforms. And we've got some narrative case material. I wouldn't say it's terribly sophisticated, but nonetheless illustrative of various cases that suggest that part of what's going on here is that these crises do hollow out government capacity, and they also do lead governments, in many cases, to do things that are anti-liberal in order to preserve the financial and banking system, even when they put policy reforms on the books. Financial sector size, as I was suggesting earlier, inhibits both a larger financial sector, inhibits making financial reform in the first place, but if it does get undertaken, it also inhibits the implementation of the reform. The IMF structural adjustment programs promote the policy change in a neoliberal direction. Countries do what the IMF tells them they have to do in order to get the money, but then when they have the money, they don't follow through, or are less likely to follow through than other countries. There are a wide variety of robustness checks that we engage in without droning on for too much longer. There are these fixed effects that we're including in these models can create what's referred to as an incidental parameters problem. There are various ways around this. When we do that, it turns out the results are quite robust. Again, we've used a 3-year window to measure when a structural break takes place. If we use a 2-year or a 4-year window, the results, again, are unchanged. There are a battery of omitted variables. Well, they're omitted variables that turn out not to matter, but there are a wide variety of things that might matter. Exposure to international trade, additional political institutions, additional measures of the political business cycle, leader tenure, elections, the size of the public sector, global monetary conditions, more fine-grained measures of democracy, diffusion and contagion, either from geographically proximate countries or for countries that share similar profiles, either in terms of trade relations or financial systems. None of these factors have a significant effect in either of the models, and none of these factors have any effect on the key independent variables in the paper. So to briefly conclude, studies of policy reform have emphasized the distinction between the making the policy itself and implementing it, but studies of financial policy have not drawn this distinction very typically. There are exceptions that have to do with international standards, including a paper by Lena Mosley and a book by Andrew Walter, but they deal with a very, very narrow slice of financial reform in general. So what we've tried to do here is to distinguish between reforms that for whatever reason aren't implemented, don't have an effect and the like, from those reforms that are implemented and do have an effect. And what we have found is that the conditions that give rise to the policy reform are, in various respects, different from the conditions that give rise to whether the reform is in fact implemented or not. And with that, I will stop and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thanks, Ed.
You're welcome.
Well, that was that was a very interesting paper, and I want to focus on what I think is the biggest contribution, and at the same time where there is the most room to improve, I guess, which is the measurement issue. Well, the conceptual and measurement issue. What is the de facto policy implementation? So I just want to start with a conceptual issue that I thought was a little underdeveloped in papers, which is the distinction that between de jure and de facto reform, right? And here, the paper makes this, maps this distinction onto reform adoption and the economic outcome that you would expect from the reforms. Right? And I think here there's some room for ambiguity in the sense that it's not clear that this would be de facto policy implementation itself or policy and effectiveness, right? So there are two issues that, so when you adopt a policy and it's in fact implemented, it might not actually, you might not actually see the results that you expect from that specific policy. And from both from the conceptual side and the measurement side of the paper, it's not clear that this possibility is covered under the strategy, the empirical strategy of the paper. So I thought it would be, it would make it, I think the paper on the conceptual side needs to make a more convincing case for why the results that we see and the measure, the resulting measure that comes out of the paper is not only measuring policy ineffectiveness, but is also actually capturing reforms that were not implemented. And since implementations, we can only do that, the paper does that indirectly through the economic outcomes. I think that becomes a very critical issue for, especially for the inferences and the regressions later on. But for measurement, so I think there are interesting things that could be done to try to circumvent those issues a bit. And so now I'm going to try to focus a bit on the measurement strategy here. So you start with the Jure measurement from the AER paper and the subsequent updates. And it includes 7 different dimensions, right? Credit controls, interest rates, entry barriers, state ownerships, and things like that. But when you move on to the de facto, to constructing the de facto measurement, you also have 7 indicators, but they don't really map out into those 7 initial dimensions, right? They're very aggregate outcome measures from the financial and economic side of each country. So I think there's this raises this is the first point I think that raises some measurement issues. That is, it is that for a lot of those indicators, they have multiple causes, so we don't know exactly whether the reforms would actually have any effect on them by themselves, or if they're being caused by some other omitted variables. And also, I think that could be solved by including a few other indicators that are more direct consequences of the 7 dimensions of the reforms. So I think some of those indicators could be capital flows themselves. So since we're one of the policy dimensions from the Jure measure is just capital account liberalization, you could just look at the time series of capital flows and try to distinguish structural breaks over there, and that would be a direct observable implications of capital account liberalization. Right? Something similar could be done with foreign participation in the banking sector, which is another of the dimensions. On the private credit, for example, I think a better measure might be private credit as a share of total credit and not as a share of GDP, because if it's about financial repression, then what we want to know is the relative participation of private credit relative to total credit, right? And so, yeah, I'm going to send you all the details of this, but I think there are like more direct and observable consequences from these policies that would be better measures of the expected effects of reforms than these very aggregate measures that could be caused by multiple processes and business cycles and things like that. A second aspect is, I think, the biggest missing piece in the measure is the international economy. And it's also a consequence of this first problem. So I think there are many of those measures, interest rates, inflation, I don't remember all of them at the top of my head, but a bunch of them are, especially in developing countries, are largely caused by movements in the international economy, liquidity and capital flows, risk aversion, and things like that. One way to deal with that is what you did, which is to include, for example, U.S. interest rates as controlling the regressions. But I think a more principled way would be to actually model, include those in a model of the initial indicators themselves. And so, for example, take each of the series that you use to detect the structural breaks and actually find what are the exogenous and important determinants of that, both in domestically, the domestic business cycle, international business cycle, model those series and try to detect the structural breaks from their residuals, which I think is a better way to try to capture the idea of policy implementation. And so you're capturing the variation, the domestic variation in a policy that is not coming from these exogenous forces. And I think a better way to do that is to do that before you actually run the regression, so that the instances of policy implementation that you find in the first place are actually the results of policy movements and not exogenous shocks. So I think that would be actually make the measure even stronger in this sense. There's actually an interesting study by Fatas and Mihov in 2013, a review of financial economics and statistics, and they're interested in a similar issue. It's not policy implementation, but they want to isolate a measure of policy stance that captures the portion of this discretionary fiscal policy that is not explained by the state of business cycle, and so they also use these residuals as their measure of policy variation, net of everything else that doesn't have to do with discretion of the policymakers or the state and the economy. And my third point about measurement here is about the detecting structural breaks. So the little I know about this methodology, and I don't know very much, is that there are usually issues of statistical power in detecting structural breaks. I don't know about the specific tests that you use in the paper, but usually those tests are not very good at detecting structural shifts when they happen. So it means that they typically fail to find a lot of the actual structural breaks that exist in the series. And I'm guessing that part of the gap that you find between the jury and policy adoption could be a function of just the low power of these tests. So you're not finding all the structural breaks that there could be in the series, and therefore there's this big gap between adoption and implementation that could be a statistical artifact. I don't think that's probably driving most of the variation in the data, but that could be an issue. And I guess one way to go around this is just to use the same methodology to detect the jury policy changes. So use the original series, which from what I understand are there's policy indices, right, that continues from 0 to 1, and try to detect the structural breaks in them instead of using the dichotomized measure that the authors provide. So you would have this symmetric methodology for both series, and they, whichever of them have low power ratios, I mean, it would manifest themselves in both series, right? So they would make the two series comparable in a way, I guess. And you might have fewer episodes of reforms probably overall in your data set, but at least the discrepancy between those two would not be driven by those power ratios, I guess. That's one possibility. And I don't want to make this too long, so just one final comment about the Logit and the multinomial regressions. I like very much that you're using in the multinomial Logit, you're presenting the results which are the probability of policy reform, of implementing the reform,